The method of our Bund to combat this Jewish-inspired boycott is the effectively working German-American Business League, which successfully diverts the purchasing power of our white American people from the boycott Jew to Gentile merchant.
It's February 20th, 1939. And a German-American Bund leader gives an anti-Semitic speech to more than 20,000 followers at Madison Square Garden. Minutes later, the keynote speaker, Bundesfuhrer Fritz Kuhn, is welcomed to the stage.
We love him, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Fritz Kuhn.
Ladies and gentlemen, you all have heard of me through the Jewish-controlled press as a creature with horns, a cloven hoof, and a long tail.
Behind the podium, an enormous illustration of George Washington looms large over a parade of flag bearers, drummer boys, and loyal Bund members in stormtrooper uniforms.
This was Kuhn's moment. And the audience was with him. They were soaking it in, and he was soaking them in. It was a kind of a love affair between the speaker and the audience.
I say we will not fail you when called upon to give every lawful support in our power in the fight to break the grip and the parasite hand of Jewish communism in our schools, our universities, our very homes.
In the crowd that night, a 26-year-old Brooklyn plumber named Isadore Greenbaum is slowly making his way toward the elevated stage.
And he worked his way down, and he made it to the floor. And he said what he saw was people in suits, ties, a couple dentists he knew, and then they started doing the Heil Hitler thing. Every time he would say the speaker something negative about the Jews.
Despite being perhaps the only Jew among thousands of German-American Bund members and Hitler admirers, Isadore Greenbaum decides that someone needs to put a stop to the anti-Semitic hate speech filling the garden.
And he told me, if this guy says one more thing, I'm going to jump up there and punch him in the face and just take him out.
It is a standing complaint of the Jews that they are the persecuted. So they have the utmost liberty in the United States and are filling most places in the public life in proportion to their numbers and all the other.
In that moment, Isadore makes the bold choice to go it alone. It's a rendezvous with destiny that will nearly cost him his life and change it forever. This is Star-Spangled Fascism, The Fuehrer and the Plumber, Part 2.
They would have an insurrection. They would take over the Capitol building. They would take over the White House. They felt that the majority of Americans would follow them.
I'm historian Bradley W. Hart, author of the award-winning book Hitler's American Friends. In this podcast, we're examining fascist leaders and movements that have emerged here in the United States over the past century. We'll look at what fueled their authoritarian ambitions, the supporters who flocked to them, and the Americans who stood in their way. In this episode, we'll continue to examine the leader of perhaps the most prominent pro-fascist organization pre-World War II, Fritz Kuhn and the German-American Bund.
And that is just what our Jewish friends wish to prevent. They know that the German-American element is justified to claim political representation in our government, and that the day will come no matter who stands in our way.
We pick up from the critical moment when plumber Isadore Greenbaum decides to confront the self-professed American Fuehrer at Madison Square Garden. The only problem is that Greenbaum is surrounded by 20,000 die-hard Bund supporters.
The reign of terror through which you passed through in the war.
I spoke with Brett Siciliano, Isadore Greenbaum's grandson. He told me about the dramatic moment when his grandfather decided he had to act to put a stop to Fritz Kuhn and his followers' hate speech that night.
He jumped over the front rail of the stage, got entangled in the wires, the microphone, so he decided to pull him, and by that time the German bodyguards jumped and grabbed my grandfather. He said he was like a foot away from grabbing the speaker, and they all jumped on him and started beating his ass really bad. And if it happened anywhere else, he'd probably be a dead man. But he had the police pulling the Germans off of him. The policemen knew my grandfather too, so they were protecting him. And if you've seen some of the pictures, they ripped his pants off. He lost his wallet, he lost his money, and they broke his cheekbone and his nose.
All right, be seated, please. One fanatical don't make any difference, ladies and gentlemen.
The audience was cheering. They were enjoying this.
That's Fritz Kuhn biographer Arnie Bernstein, the author of the book Swastika Nation.
There wasn't the ability to stop this rally because of freedom of speech, but Isadore Greenbaum acted because in his guts, he knew this was the thing that had to be done. He was a one-man army. He saw something that was wrong, and he acted. Without any consideration for bodily harm, he was fighting for something bigger than himself. He was fighting for his people, and he was determined to put a stop to those who would have him wiped out.
We have to remember that this is 1939. World War II hasn't even started in Europe yet. The US is still years away from fighting Nazism or fascism on the actual battlefield. And Isadore Greenbaum, a 26-year-old Jewish plumber from Brooklyn, has tried to strike a physical blow against representatives of fascism and Nazism right here in the US. There's tens of thousands of protesters outside Madison Square Garden, tangling with the police, tangling with Boone supporters who would have liked to strike that blow. But it's Greenbaum who has the opportunity to potentially do so. And even though Greenbaum never actually lays a finger on Kuhn, it's an incredibly symbolic and important moment. Brett Siciliano told me his grandfather simply felt that he had to do something to stop Kuhn's hateful speech that night.
And I asked him his intentions. He goes, to shut that guy up. And I went full steam ahead, and no one knew quite how to feel. Because as he was amping the crowd up, my grandpa put a stop to it. So it changed the whole dynamic of the rest of the show, because he was the final speaker.
Isadore Greenbaum was alive, but he was not out of danger, either physically or legally. Brett Siciliano recounted the story of how the New York City police officers first took his grandfather to the emergency room before booking him into jail.
There was a German doctor there who went and saw my grandfather. And he said, "Hey, I hear you're a big hero, Greenbaum, jumping up on the stage and tearing up things. You're a proud Jew, huh?" And he goes, "Yes, I am." And then the doctor said, "Well, I have to do some examinations on you."
He came to Greenbaum with an enormous hypodermic needle. Greenbaum later said he never saw a hypodermic needle that long in his life. It was injected into his lower back. He felt a searing pain rip throughout his body the moment the needle entered. He never knew what was injected into him. But for the rest of his life, he always had pain in the area of the injection.
After being booked for disorderly conduct, the New York City cops that rescued Greenbaum from the stage privately congratulated their prisoner on his bold stand.
A lot of the police knew of him. It was a small-knit community. They said, "Wow, I can't believe you jumped up there. You could have died. That was crazy." I was thinking of doing it. Everyone was thinking of doing it, but my grandfather did. He just wanted to stop this rhetoric. It was just very anti-Semitic and driving him crazy.
He was taken to night court. Greenbaum was asked by the judge, "Why did you go there?" He said, "I went down to the garden without any intention of interrupting, but being that they talked so much against my religion and there's so much persecution, I lost my head and felt it was my duty to talk."
The judge says, "Do you realize what could have happened because of this behavior? How many people could have been hurt? There's 20,000 in Madison Square Garden. And you didn't realize how many people could be hurt." And my grandfather, he defended his faith again and said, based on that Jewish rhetoric and anti-Semitism, do you realize how many people could potentially be hurt because of that and killed over those statements he was making?
The judge fined Greenbaum $25, which today would be more than $500. This is a lot of money in the Great Depression for a man trying to support his family. And since Greenbaum had actually lost his pants in the scuffle on stage, he also didn't have his wallet.
He goes, "Judge, I have no money." The story has it is they started passing around a little thing, all the police around, and they all reached in their wallet and chipped in.
So Greenbaum's fine was paid. He was released from jail to his wife and infant son. In the days that followed, donations to the Greenbaum family began flowing in from all over the country. The money often came in with telegrams congratulating Isadore on his courageous act. And despite being unemployed at the time of his arrest, Greenbaum's wife Gertrude insisted that Isadore give every cent of that money to a good cause. News of Greenbaum's courageous act quickly spread across the country and, in fact, internationally as well.
Hitler! Sieg! Heil! Sieg! Sieg!
Nazi propaganda newspapers actually ran stories claiming that Kuhn had almost been assassinated by a Jewish conspiracy, very much a conspiracy theory in line with Nazi ideology, but completely false. Kuhn and the Bund had really crossed the line here. Violence had been seen on the streets of New York City and within Madison Square Garden itself, one of the country's most important political and social venues. Kuhn had operated largely unimpeded for years, but now he'd crossed the line in a very public way with some very powerful people. In a matter of days, the man who saw himself as the future American Fuhrer would be running scared, and the Bund's very existence would be hanging in the balance. Following the German-American Bund rally in February of 1939, New York City Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia was receiving a terrific backlash from his constituents. They were furious about U.S. fascists having marched proudly through the streets of Manhattan, carrying Nazi swastikas, and the heavy-handed treatment of the protesters outside Madison Square Garden itself. Fritz Kuhn had deliberately broken his promise to Mayor LaGuardia and his administration to keep out anti-Semitic messaging and Nazi propaganda from the venue.
The thing about the Bund was they were small, but they were loud, and they were controversial, and people pay attention to that. They saw Der Tag, which translates to the day, as their moment when they would seize power. They would have an insurrection. They would take over the Capitol building. They would take over the White House. They felt that the majority of Americans would follow them.
That's Fritz Kuhn biographer Arnie Bernstein, author of the book Swastika Nation.
After the rally, Mayor LaGuardia was furious that everything had gotten out of hand in his city, that it felt it was a black mark on New York. LaGuardia wanted to get Kuhn. He knew he couldn't get him on freedom of speech. So he called in his district attorney, Thomas Dewey, and he said, "What can we do about this?" They decided to follow the same path that the federal government had gotten Al Capone. Let's look at his taxes. They couldn't pin any murders on Capone, but they could certainly look at his income taxes. It was the same with Fritz Kuhn.
Most German Americans wanted nothing to do with the Bund, and they overwhelmingly rejected them. But the Bund did have tens of thousands of members all over the country. And looking at the money wasn't a bad idea. Remember, the Bund was collecting dues from its members every month. There were refreshments for sale, souvenirs, and pro-Nazi literature available at every event you could go to. Some Bund chapters even owned and operated restaurants and social halls you could rent out for events. Fritz Kuhn actually operated a real estate empire during his leadership of the organization, using membership dues to purchase land all over the country, in part for the youth camps, but also for housing developments for the Bund's members. Some of these communities actually had restrictive covenants that prevented certain people from buying homes there. And in fact, some of them actually restricted homeownership to members of what was called the Aryan race. There was also a almost business racketeering aspect to the Bund's operations. There was a business league that required you to pay dues if you were a German-American business owner in exchange for being given preferential access to Bund-related contracts, or simply to be protected by Bund members. There were Bund-related organizations that manufactured the uniforms that members were supposedly required to purchase. There were German-American associated companies that produced the flags for the Bund. At least some of the money from these various revenue streams found their way back into the Bund's coffers in New York City. And Fritz Kuhn, being the national leader of the Bund, was in charge, ultimately, of all of these accounts. Kuhn himself, as it turned out, engaged in some fairly questionable financial practices. We don't actually know how much money Kuhn was personally worth in modern terms, but he was frequently taking decadent trips across the country. He had numerous cars he was seen riding around in. He was seen frequenting expensive nightclubs and other venues. And indeed, he was spending some of the money, as it turned out, on some extramarital activities. The reason that Kuhn was able to get away with all this for so long was the way that the organization itself was structured. As the Bund's national leader, Fritz Kuhn had basically unlimited access to do whatever he wanted with the Bund's money, in part because the Bund itself operated on a very similar model to Nazism.
The Bund operated under something called the leadership principle, which is a standard of any kind of fascist organization. The leader has all the power, and you do what the leader says, no questions asked. So Kuhn was in charge of everything.
The pressure on Mayor LaGuardia to do something about the Bund was growing by the day. New York City District Attorney Thomas Dewey had an interesting idea of how the Bund might be combated. He decided to raid Kuhn's national headquarters in Yorkville, Manhattan, to check out their financial books. What they found in the books was pretty shocking. There was evidence of embezzlement, of actually paying money to some of Fritz Kuhn's extramarital paramours. There were taxes that apparently weren't being paid, including on some of the souvenirs being sold at the Madison Square Garden rally. And there was money being directly funneled to Kuhn and his various cronies within the Bund's leadership. Kuhn claimed to have repaid most of the money to the Bund, but the fact that the Bund's financial records were almost non-existent, combined with the fact that Kuhn's deputies claimed to not know anything about the organization's finances themselves, put the blame firmly on Kuhn himself. Kuhn's own power had set the stage for his downfall. Within months of the February rally, Thomas Dewey brought a criminal case against Fritz Kuhn. Kuhn didn't go down quietly. In a moment of what might be construed as madness, he actually fled from the authorities, but he was eventually arrested. He was put on trial, and in December of 1939, less than 12 months after the February rally, he was sentenced to prison. His first stop would be Sing Sing. The man who saw himself as a future American Fuehrer would now be known simply as convict number 97363. Kuhn had time to prepare for prison. He even appointed an acting Fuehrer to take his place, clearly anticipating that someday he'd return to lead the movement. And that's exactly what his political idol, Adolf Hitler, had done himself. He was in prison, and it was there that he wrote the book Mein Kampf that became a bestseller, and just a few years later, Hitler had become Chancellor of Germany. But for now, the Bund was rudderless. There was simply no one to take Kuhn's place as a dynamic national leader.
The Bund carried on, but their power was certainly diminishing. They didn't have a strong leader that they had in Kuhn. And leadership passed between his various lieutenants, who were just as corrupt as Kuhn.
Things only went downhill for the Bund after 1939. There was more infighting than ever before at the local level. Some chapters, especially on the West Coast, started to withhold their dues from the national office. Individual members began grumbling that the East Coast Bund chapters had spent too much of their money defending Kuhn in his legal affairs. The U.S. government began paying more attention too. Bund members knew that their meetings were being actively watched by federal agents. Investigators for the House Un-American Activities Committee compiled long lists of all the license plates they'd seen outside Bund events and properties. Being a member of the Bund, or even attending its events or visiting its campsites, was becoming dangerous.
As we got closer and closer to World War II, people started leaving the Bund, and they left the Bund in droves. They didn't want to be associated with this. And then came Pearl Harbor.
Japan shows her cloven hoof in a sneak attack that transforms the USS Arizona into a blazing pyre.
The Bund actually managed to persist for a while after Pearl Harbor, but being a member was a surefire way to attract unwanted attention from the federal government. In June of 1942, the Bund's new national leader actually committed suicide on his way to New York City after being subpoenaed by a federal grand jury. After that, the Bund's national chapter basically disappeared. But the Bund's local chapters didn't all go away. Some of them actually rebranded themselves, and this is serious, as German singing societies. That's right. German-American Bund chapters overnight transformed themselves into places where the German community held choir practice, supposedly without any politics at all being involved.
And that was the end of the German-American Bund. Not with a bang, but a whimper.
Fritz Kuhn ends up spending the entirety of World War II in and out of prison. He actually escapes from one prison and ends up being arrested and sent to another, and he finally ended up being sent to an internment camp in Texas for Germans. At the end of the war, Fritz Kuhn was actually forcibly denaturalized by the US government on the grounds that he had lied on his citizenship application by retaining loyalty to another country. He was eventually deported back to Germany, where he served 2 additional terms in prison, including a period of time in the former Dachau concentration camp, which was now being used by the Allies. His wife left him, and he was largely forgotten to history despite having led one of the most prominent and largest fascist organizations in US history. A man who was at one point one of the most feared men in the country by average citizens and the US government alike was now living in obscurity in war-torn post-war Germany.
Kuhn spent his final days in total obscurity. He was a chain smoker throughout his life, had severe heart problems as a result, severe lung problems as a result. And he died in 1951.
But no, my friends, the press, the radio, and the cinema are in the hand of the Jews.
Fritz Kuhn was the great American Fuehrer in his own eyes. And in the end, he died a pathetic, sick individual.
Shortly before his death, Kuhn was asked why he'd followed Hitler so vehemently. Disillusioned by the collapse and defeat of Nazi Germany, Kuhn replied, quote, "Who would have known it would end like this?"
There was never any danger of Fritz Kuhn achieving political power. His dream was impossible to achieve, and it's democracy that ultimately brought Fritz Kuhn and his fascist dreams to an end.
Fritz Kuhn's story was over, but Isadore Greenbaum's wasn't. When the US entered World War II, Isadore Greenbaum joined the Merchant Marine. He was actually on a ship supporting the D-Day landings in June 1944. At various points, the War Department used his story of that night in Madison Square Garden to help build support for the war effort. There's a great interview with him in the newspaper Stars and Stripes. The headline reads, "One Punch Izzy, Still in There Punching." The interviewer asked him why he had tried to confront Kuhn that dramatic night in 1939. His answer was simple. He said, "Gee, what would you have done if you were in my place, listening to that SOB, hollering against the government and publicly kissing Hitler's behind while thousands cheered?" Well, I did it.
He's always told me that. He was the wrong place at the right time. He sucked it up as long as he could, and he just did what he did. He said it came out of him. He didn't even know that was in him. He just didn't like hearing that he was less of a human than any other person. Maybe he was out of line, but sometimes if you want change, you got to be a little abrasive.
After the war, Isadore Greenbaum moved to the city of Tustin, California with his family. He took up fishing as his hobby, and for years he was a regular feature on the Newport Beach Pier. The locals in Newport Beach knew him by a different name. They knew him simply as Pops Greenbaum, and few, if any, knew about his brush with fame a few decades earlier. Pops Greenbaum died in his grandson Brett's arms in 1997 at the age of 84. He was survived by his wife Gertrude, 3 children, 7 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren. His obituary in the local newspaper made no reference to Fritz Kuhn.
He was a regular guy, not a politician, not somebody with power, just a regular guy who didn't like what he was seeing and said, something has to be done. Nobody else is doing it. I have to do it.
On a cold February night in 1939, Isadore Greenbaum took a bold stand against anti-Semitism and fascism in the United States. It was an act of defiance that put his life at risk and changed it forever. But ultimately, it helped open the door to the forces of law and order, bringing down the would-be American Fuehrer. In our next episode, we'll explore the career of a Hollywood screenwriter turned mystic who claimed that Jesus told him to form his own armed fascist group in the United States. But for now, That's Star-Spangled Fascism. Special thanks to Isadore Greenbaum's grandson, Brett Siciliano, and to Arnie Bernstein, the author of Swastika Nation, Fritz Kuhn and the Rise and Fall of the German-American Bund. This program was edited by Brian Fantinelli, mixed and mastered by Joseph Powers, and executive produced by Brendan Gokel. Be sure to subscribe to the Star-Spangled Fascism podcast wherever you get your podcasts, on our YouTube page, and follow us now on social media. If you have a question about the podcast, email us at questions@starspangledfascismpodcast.com. I'm Bradley W. Hart. Thank you for listening.